of this Public Talks on Cities, and a very warm welcome to our speaker, Professor Nima Kudwa. But before I introduce the speaker briefly, I've been asked to make some announcements about forthcoming talks in Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. On the 3rd of April, there is a public lecture, and this is in the series, this is the other series, not the city series, Science, Society and Nature, Professor R. Geeta, University of Delhi, Biodiversity and Bioresources through the Evolutionary Glass. On 4th April, there is a seminar by Dr. Samiksha Sehrawat from Newcastle University. She's going to talk on what is colonial about colonial medical care. On 7th of April, there is a public lecture, and this is in Hindi. It's in the series Samaj or Itihas. Dr. Sadan Jha from the Center for Social Sciences, Surat. It's called Ek Nayi Bhasha Ka Uday, Devanagari Jagat Mein Dekhna aur Dikhana. And on 9th of April, there's a public lecture. This is the third public lecture series. It's called India in Transition series. This is Professor Nandini Sundar, University of Delhi. It's called Resistance, Counter-Insurgency and Democracy in India. I'd also like to announce that on 24th April, in the Cities series, Professor Janaki Nair from Jawaharlal Nehru University will be speaking. There is also a series that Nehru Memorial Museum and Library has published a whole series of occasional papers which are available, and you can buy them for 100 rupees each. I think there are 81 occasional papers. Many more are forthcoming. Some, I'm told, are also on the website. And the ones which have been recently published are K. Satyanarayana, Politics of Caste and Identity in Contemporary South India, Anuradha Kalhan, The Possibility of Stimulating Inclusive Growth, and Narendra Shukla, Bharatiya Swatantrata Andolan, or Pratibandhit Sahitya. A brief introduction to Professor Kudwa. She is Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. She directs the International Studies in Planning program and is faculty lead of the interdisciplinary Nilgiris Field Learning Center, a collaborative project of the Keystone Foundation and Cornell University. She is co-editor of 2 books which are forthcoming. One is called Cities of Global South Reader, and the second one is called Rethinking Informalization. And she's also working on a monograph on the Indian city Mangalore. And I think her focus is really on smaller city and not the big metropolis, if I get it right. A very warm welcome to you, and we're looking forward to your talk. No, absolutely. No, it's perfect.
I could talk forever.
Okay.
Problem of professorships. Thank you, Partha, for introducing me, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's both an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I also want to thank, I guess in absentia, Mahesh, for inviting me to be here. We've been talking for many years, and he thought it might be interesting for me to come and talk here and get your feedback on some of the questions that I'm sort of exploring. So I'm not a historian. I should start by saying that for those of you who are historians in the room. But what I want to do today is discuss some ideas from an exploratory essay that I'm working on history and the city, but also sort of history, memory, and the city. While the concepts don't always emerge clearly in a neat progression, the central question for me really is, how do we planners, interested as we are in shaping the urban experience, understand or even use history to theorize the city, which by further implication is to understand how to intervene in the city and how to plan it. So an important subtext, which Partha sort of mentioned already, that you should remember as I work my way through my argument, is that I am primarily interested in small cities and towns. And these tend to be forgotten places that exist in the periphery. Places that are not often the subject of historians or planners' interests. So these are places, especially sort of in the Indian or the Chinese context, that can be quite large. So, sort of definitionally, these are places that are less than 1 million in population. What is, sort of interesting sort of fact is that the majority of the Indian urban population actually lives in small places and not in the large cities, which so sort of, control or shape our imagination and theorizing. So despite their demographic importance, as the historian James Heitzman has pointed out, there is a paucity of information on small cities, and there are enormous challenges involved in historical documentation of what he calls middle cities and middle towns. There are very few developed, well-researched historical or contemporary accounts, and most everything that planners like I have to work off is based on assembling available fragments in somewhat legible ways. So in assembling these fragments, planners are trying to provide a structure and a framework for their investigation rather than a definitive interpretation. So it's really hard to sort of remain careful and rigorous in the absence of coherent data sets, in the absence of coherent sort of narratives, clear narratives. So it's a huge challenge. So when I speak of urban planning and urban planners, I am using an idealized, but hopefully not an ideological trope, which I need to specify to some extent before I move any further. So we planners are a much reviled group in most places across the world. We're accused simultaneously of possessing too little or no imagination, or of asserting too much control in order to reshape the city in the image that power desires and according to the dictates of our political masters. And yet, our fast-growing cities, those sort of, what did Gautam Bhatia call it a couple of days ago in a column that he wrote in the Times of India, he described them as inchoate, anarchic organisms, right? And so these anarchic organisms need to be managed, they need to be planned, they need to be researched, their workings exposed and made legible to some extent. So, going back to city planning, it's existed clearly for as long as cities have. But this contemporary profession that I speak of experts with particular mindsets, training, and toolkits who plan for the city as a whole is a very distinctly modern, even 20th century phenomena. So these sort of 20th century planning that I'm thinking about, it considers both the circumstances and the context of the places where planning must occur or where it needs to occur. It struggles, or we struggle, with the question of how to create spaces and places that are imbued with meaning and value, that provide city residents with a sense of coherence, continuity, and identity. And this is where history comes in. But planning is also against history and precedent. It is a forward-looking act. It involves articulating a vision for the future while managing the everyday present, which in itself is rooted in the past. So it's a contradiction in a sense. So currently in democratic polities, planning is framed by the ideals of equity, of justice, and of voice, of providing opportunities for engagement to all residents, even if that does not happen in reality. So good planning, this idealized notion of planning, thus involves bringing people into planning processes to have difficult conversations so that they can together collectively articulate what the future city may be. It is a normative activity based on collectively defined values, goals, and hopes. So given all these ways of understanding planning, the ideal planner then is an imaginative researcher and educator. She is a technocrat and a regulator, a manager of processes to bring people together, and a manager of change, which can be both as much about hope for a better future as it is about grieving and experiencing a sense of loss for a bygone past. To be all this, planners need to understand the city, how it emerged, and how it thrives or goes into decline. This brings me back to my central question. How do we planners, interested as we are in shaping the urban experience, understand or even use history to theorize the city? So for most people, who have thought a little bit about this or even considered it for a moment as they're driving by or, walking through the environments they live in, one immediate answer to how planners use history is in choosing what to preserve from the past. Which paths, which neighborhoods, which monuments, and to what extent? Should these be maintained as they exist in the present moment? Should they be cleared of the detritus of generations of accumulation so they can be restored to a carefully reconstructed remote past? So as the planner Kevin Lynch wrote in 1972 in this wonderful book called What Time Is This Place?, we tend to want to preserve objects at the city scale from times that are fairly remote. just as we recycle the immediate near past much faster than we acknowledge. Studies from 1960s London, for example, that Lynch cites in his book, revealed that the average life of a London building to be just 30 years. Anecdotal sort of evidence from China, contemporary China, seems to suggest an even shorter cycle, 20 years. So progressive modification and change in urban environments, the shedding of sort of the junkyard of the past, escaping from the past, happens against this backdrop of very selected preservation based on the needs of the present moment, for symbols of continuity, for holding the memory of certain events, or for asserting group identity, power, and more. So historic preservation planners, who are a very particular subset of these urban planners I was talking about, myself included, sort of historic preservation planners then draw very heavily from and contribute to the work of urban historians. In doing so, planners have to remember what historians have long emphasized, that understanding whose history is being uncovered and recorded, by whom and why, is crucial. So as students of the city, planners must also know how historians theorize the city, even if historians are often reluctant to make that evident. So I won't focus on this much more, except to point out that many historical studies tend to portray cities as discrete, imageable entities of very clear shape and form, neutral containers for life to thrive and flourish. So this very simplistic view was challenged way back when, in 1937, by Lewis Mumford. Mumford was very sort of heavily influenced by Patrick Geddes, who articulated his idea. He's a Scottish biologist by training, but Geddes articulated his idea of the city in part through his work in cities like Indore in India. So Mumford described the city as institutional process and as part of a region. The city did not exist in isolation. So Mumford and Geddes and others who came after them used history to understand and theorize the city. As the sociologist Charles Tilly, pointed out in a very well-known essay from 1996 titled, "What Good is Urban History?" the broadest and most compelling theorizations of the city draw on a historical understanding to allow us to read the urban structures and processes we inherit, and to make sense of the social and political relations that produce and are produced by life in the city. So while Tilly's sort of sociological perspective is important, it is the work of people like Henri Lefebvre that is fundamental, I think, to understanding the relationship of space and history, the city and history. So Lefebvre emphasized that every social relation needed a spatial, material underpinning. So in the production of space, for example, he notes that something, and I'm quoting, "something always survives or endures." His work, like David Harvey's that followed, was an early exploration of the production of that something, i.e. space, of how people, through various spatial practices, generated lived spaces of the city. Yet Lefebvre did not fetishize space, arguing instead for a critical historical analysis which could explain the changing urban experience in contemporary cities. Now, I can't, clearly, for reasons of time, I can't discuss Lefebvre or Harvey in any great detail here. But what I want to do instead is to sort of draw your attention to the work of another geographer, Doreen Massey. So Massey is well known for her writing on reconceptualizing space and articulating the relationship of space to politics. So she did this study of the main plaza in Mexico City, and she explored what she called the internal intensities of individual cities. So by this she meant very specific histories. And she took care, however, to place the city in its region, in the world, in a wider set of interconnections. So in doing so, she demonstrated how this act, of placing the city within its wider interconnections, how this act potentially reorders our understanding of Mexico City and its relationships, our sort of vision and understanding of the plaza and how it functions. Thus, when Massey looked at a city in history, she saw multiple histories, a mixture that evolves over time in the geographic sense of expressing both the specificity of a place and its changing links with the world beyond. So to quote Massey, in each moment of its history, a city is thus a focus of a wider geography. It is a space of continual change, negotiation, and renegotiation. So what I've done so far is taken you on sort of a somewhat extended tour of planning, the work of planners, and then, of just sort of one way or a couple of ways in which history gets used by planners to theorize and even make the city. I would call this a rooted theorizing, where temporality and spatial context are folded into how we learn to understand the city and to act in it. But what does this all mean when it comes to fast-growing small cities like Mangalore that I've been studying? And most of you, I hope, know where Mangalore is, right? Which, like James Heitzman has noted in his essay in the Journal of Urban History, cities like Mangalore, lack biographers. They lack those careful scrutinizers of archives and extractors of oral histories who can compile rich narratives of a place through time. So how do we, planners and ordinary citizens, learn about place when we subscribe to the need for rooted theorizing? I want to just illustrate, I think, some possible answers to this question by using my work on Mangalore. Mangalore is a small city with a long unrecorded history. Yet there are several glimpses into what Arrighi and Hamashita would call the short and medium-run historical cycles. I'm thinking here in particular of the work of Surendra Rao and Keshavan Velutat's students in the Department of History in Mangalore University. So Arrighi and Hamashita's work, they're sociologists, historical sociologists, is on how dynamic political economy processes shape spatial regions over time. Sort of, it links back to this idea of interconnections that Massey referred to. So there is in their sort of formulation the idea of a short run of recent patterns, as well as longer term processes that occur at various nested scales, from the local to the regional, the national, and most importantly, the world regional levels. So crucial events and transformative shifts create distinct temporal periods. Thus, to understand Mangalore's urbanism and the construction of this idea of region, I have to start with identifying patterns in the long cycles of history. These, drawing on evidence from the larger region, particularly the Konkan and the Malabar coast, situates the region first as a series of vassal states of Deccan-based empires, suggesting origins for persistent patterns of rule, tax regimes, and governance. So the region was possibly shaped as much by the desires of distant empires, as I pointed out, that held power at various points, as it was by the local palegars and the people of the bazaar economy, for people who think of it in those terms. And it was shaped equally by the traders, pilgrims, and travelers along the economic and cultural circuits of the Indian Ocean. So as part of these sort of trading networks of the Indian Ocean rim, Mangalore looked outwards, even as the town itself turned its back to the sea, and the localities that emerged allowed communities to self-segregate into smaller, whatever the words are, because there's like 4 different languages. So this intermediate, so that's sort of the long run cycle, right? In the ways in which Hamashita and Arrighi talk about it. The intermediate cycle starts with the region's incorporation into the British Empire and Western colonial trading networks in 1799. And the disruption of very long-held patterns followed by an entrepreneurial burst of activity along with sort of this rising nationalist fervor in the first decades of the 20th century. So the region reorients towards Bombay and Madras. Migration and investment patterns change. The banks that we all know of today, Canara Bank, Corporation Bank, Syndicate Bank, there's a long list, all begin to sort of, start at that point in time. Syndicate Bank, maybe I mentioned it already. So anyway, so the short cycle starts with Indian independence, and a decade later, the formation of Karnataka state. Community status and economic positions shift again and change during these different periods, moving in the short cycle into a much more sort of confrontational sorting out as old ties break down and new alliances are forged to gain political power and assert control over the state. So the dynamics of Mangalore's regionalism through history, this sort of dynamic that I've very, very quickly sketched out, is quite essential to understanding its everyday ordinary relations. The ways in which spatial practices create the lived city, which is the central subject of my work in the book that Partho mentioned. So like the idea of the city, the idea of region lets me take on these relationships between history and the city, and memory as well, where memory is enshrined in routines and everyday practices. So regions, like cities, are historically contingent places, born of social, economic, political, and cultural practices. Regions, like cities, are constructed by the people who live there and by those outside, by everyone who is able to draw a boundary, however fluid, contested, and changing it may be. Regions like the cities are thus imagined places of refuge and distinction, yet their shape and structure condition the very identities and possibilities that their residents may have. So to uncover both this city and the region, I also looked at various everyday practices. How, for example, a random group of people, how far, and all of them using public transportation, how far they were willing or they would travel for work, to school, their mobility patterns. I looked at the ways in which people produced and consumed particular commodities, and the ways in which middle-class residents of an older planned neighborhood in Mangalore organized to create services like garbage collection and recycling, and renovating a long-defunct park that the city government had little interest in. So all these stories, and I'm just mentioning some of them here, have several layers that, when peeled back carefully, reveal many of the issues that are quite central to the identity and character of Mangalore. So what it does, though, for me, these various ways of beginning to investigate the history of the city itself, the region, and its formation and its growth, what it does is it allows us these glimpses into spatial practices, and allows us to begin to also touch lightly on another important issue, the very segregated nature of the city itself. So first I want to talk a little bit about the commuter survey. We had 225 respondents. We interviewed them in very short 3 to 5 minute bursts. Our research assistants would be running alongside people. And they would, and we did this different times, span of a week, and our respondents were a very diverse and fairly young group. So most of them were between the ages of 18 and 31. So a fourth of the sample were +2 or students in colleges, reflecting Mangalore's standing as a center for higher education. While commuters' religious profiles matched the population profile as a whole, we found that two groups, Dalits and Adivasis, were very underrepresented. The gender ratios within these various Jati groups were more or less the same, except for the Catholics and Brahmins, where women commuters outnumbered men. And of course, it's not an of course, but amongst Muslims as well, who were overwhelmingly male. What was striking was the weighted mean distance traveled by all these commuters. 34 kilometers. That was the mean distance that people were traveling, which is a little more than half the distance to the next bustling regional hub of Udupi. So in line with what, and I can talk a lot more about the survey, and we can do this during the Q&A, but what's important, I think, to point out is that in line with what most labor market researchers, have repeatedly pointed out in the Indian context, our commuter occupational profiles correlated very closely with Jati and gender positions. So the occupational profile of male commuters, however, compared to the women, was much more varied. And the correlation between occupation and Jati was also much less clear-cut. And the exceptions were more visible across our male commuters. So what our survey really showed when we mapped Jati and religious characteristics of the commuter population to occupation was that it was the kinds of profiles that were coming out were much closer to studies of rural caste and occupations. It also parallels, interestingly enough, a study of labor occupation and firms in towns and small cities in Punjab. It's a study done by A.B. Singh, and it points out, indicates deep restrictions based on Jati and religion. So Singh's analysis shows, and I'm quoting from his report, production and exchange in Punjab are almost neatly compartmentalized along religious and caste lines. The peasants are Sikhs, Jats, whereas the merchants are Hindus, Khatris, Aroras, and Banyas. Peasants live in villages, merchants live in towns. In towns, a small elite within the Hindu trading caste dominates large industrial investment. Not at all, unlike Mangalore. Singh goes on to argue that in such highly differentiated markets, growth leads to some castes and classes reasserting their power, leading to a more marked social differentiation than before. The question for me, though, is, are the outcomes always so clear-cut? So what I did was to follow a very select group of commodities, from production and distribution to consumption, to better understand the segmented, interlocking nature of labor markets, an issue that throws additional light on intercaste and communal dynamics in the city. I want to briefly discuss two examples that I have written about elsewhere: the production of jasmine and an everyday place maintenance activity, which is also planning, right? Garbage collection and recycling. So let me start with the jasmine story. And I'm going to go through this very quickly again, right? So jasmine production, the growing of jasmine flowers, is by Catholic women and their children. The men very rarely participate. The middlemen for many, many, many centuries have been Muslims. And the consumers, of course, are all Hindu. Jasmine flowers do not appear in churches, mosques, on Hindu women, on Muslim women's or men's hair, and so on and so forth, and the Catholics too. So the spatial practices and daily routines, the planting of jasmine close to the house for tending and plucking very early in the morning. It has to be, typically it's plucked before the sun comes up, and by women and children. So there's a spatial practice of where you plant jasmine. What do where is it put along, and what kinds of houses and yards do you have to have in order to be able to be involved in the production of jasmine? The parish priests are incredibly important because they carry information on increasing yields and on finding better varietals and on how do you deal with different kinds of pesticides and so on and so forth. The incorporation of technology is a very important part of this story as well. First, the region continues to have a very, very good bus transit system, and how that bus transit system was a part of the jasmine collection process. And it was also the bus drivers and the conductors were a very important medium by which prices were transmitted across the region. Later, cell phones took on this role. Right? So, the taking of jasmine to the central market, the katte, the flower bourse, if you want to use the English term, and the conveying of prices that are set every day. So these technologies were very important in how that was happening. In contemporary Mangalore, there are transgressions. Right? The Catholic producers who now have an influx of capital from their children having gone out to the Middle East try and break free of the middlemen. One or two of them have even set up shop in the main temple square, which would have never happened even some decades ago. So this movement of jasmine to markets in, initially it was Bombay, then it was Bangalore, and now it is Dubai, is also an interesting sort of piece of what's going on in this jasmine, in the market, in the production of jasmine. But interestingly enough, unlike the move to Bombay or to Bangalore, the move of jasmine into Dubai is financed by very wealthy outsiders, Tamilian merchants who have come into the region. And more recently, just about 4 years ago, the state decided to intervene and recreate the katte, which is just outside Udupi. So the state and its agents now are trying to regulate these jasmine markets that have been controlled privately for centuries with a small collection of Catholic families and Muslim trader groups. So what's really interesting is that the spatial region that is defined by jasmine as a commodity, this commodity chain of jasmine, is even longer and larger than that defined by that commute pattern that I was talking about. It extends all the way to Udupi, to Mumbai, to Bangalore, and now Dubai. And what is also interesting in this is that this case of Jasmine production provides a snapshot into how social segregation and economic interlinkages had evolved and worked over time. The second sort of commodity that I just want to talk about a little bit is garbage. And I studied the garbage piece by paying particular attention to a community-based initiative which was started by residents of a fairly prosperous early 20th century planned locality that has seen considerable densification in the past 2 decades. So I looked at that, and I looked at recycling networks. So in this locality that I'm talking about, a single sort of block of houses that once had maybe 8 large houses in large plots now contains 10 smaller sort of houses and 3 apartment blocks containing about 36 families. So that's the level of densification I'm talking about in a matter of just 10 to 20 years. So you can imagine how much more garbage there is on each of those streets, right? I call this locality Tilak Nagar, and about 5 years before I started to look at it very closely, there was an older retired woman who had returned to live in Mangalore, in the house that she had grown up in, after 40 years of working life in northern and eastern India, and she was exasperated by the whole garbage issue and began to organize her neighbors. So what was really interesting was that most of the people who were in this organization were Catholic or Hindu. She was Brahmin, a middle-class Indian, house rich, but income poor. Her income was tied to her husband's and her job. She was a school teacher before India liberalized. So the longest story that I write is of her politicization as she faces, these overflowing garbage bins and dogs and of a political system that's resistant to change. And how she, along with all these other older sort of people who've retired in this neighborhood, set up an NGO. And they do so with help from a national organization. But they land up working very closely with their locally elected representative. And these are through, sort of various kinship and jati ties. And both of them are from the same jati. She was actually the political representative, was the organizer's niece. And they come up with a system to collect garbage and compost organic waste. They hire, interestingly enough, young men from an Adivasi community, the Koragas. And the Koragas dominate the Paura Karmikas, who are the municipal workers who collect garbage and take care of the city's sewerage system as well. So after, the story is a long one of many hiccups and fits and starts and everything else, and I won't bore you with it. But what's really interesting is that they finally land up working with these 3 young men who are all from the same family. But they're not from Mangalore. They are from a nearby town called Padbidri. So I'm going to just digress for a little bit, so I'd like you to just remember that. And then the corresponding sort of recycling networks are really different. So recycling in Mangalore is not linked to garbage, unlike all the big cities that we know. It's a delinked process. And it remains in the hands of local recyclers who are almost all Behris, which is a local Muslim community. And the Behris, who are part of the recycling sort of chains, are also sort of inserted into very large regional networks, and most of which, of course, are in the informal economy. And they've developed over many decades. So the recyclers are a mobile phone call away or a text away, and they come and move material to larger sorting yards before sending it into these regional and national networks. Mangalore is a wealthy city. The quality of its waste and its recycled waste is very high. So pellets made from Mangalore's high-end plastic waste come to Delhi for recycling. Its PET bottles go to a place called Karkar, to a highly mechanized plant that a very wealthy upper caste sort of Brahmin has set up, who has enough capital to invest in a plant like that. The intermediate level paper recycler sends paper to northern Karnataka, to the Bhadravati mills, and so on and on. So what is interesting, as I said before, about the Mangalore recycling story is the delinking of garbage and recycling, unlike big cities in India. Because the recyclers need to collect a certain tonnage for efficiency. And focusing on one small city doesn't do it. We're finding the same patterns in the Nilgiris where we're working. There's a complete sort of delinkage of the garbage and recycling chains. Now, returning to the story of sort of garbage collection in Tilak Nagar. The initiative had, like I said before, had been at work for over 5 years when I started my sort of ethnographic work there. And by the time that I had reached Mangalore, or by the time I started to study this, the Koraga young men who were part of the project were actually earning an income that was higher than the main woman organizer, the Brahmin woman organizer. There were various conflicts in this sort of jati, class, caste dynamics, and I look at them, in great length in a chapter in a book that I can tell you about later. At one point, the local Mangalore-based Koraga organizer sort of engages in this very contentious situation with the Brahmin woman and wants the Koraga boys, as they're called, to leave these demeaning caste-based jobs, and they refuse. And they refused because for them decent wages was a very important factor in their decision to stay. But there was a possibility of securing a municipal job through the Brahmin organizers' networks, and this was an important consideration. I also explained their decisions as a result of their not being from Mangalore, which allowed them to avoid the place-based authority of the Mangalore Koraga organizer. So in another incident, so there are many incidents which sort of bring out this question of the jati class dynamics in this organization and in this neighborhood. So what is interesting, though, in this larger story is how jati and caste positions persist in terms of occupation, status, the ability to get things done by persuading elected politicians and appointed bureaucrats, of how jati networks are used for ongoing support, even as the income-earning question in this particular case is turned on its head. So each of the young men, the Koraga young men, was earning between 15 and 20,000 rupees because the dues went directly to them. So by unpacking sort of jati and class, gender and age, I was able to better understand how complex mechanisms for place maintenance were organized and how outcomes played out. Now, while I use these cases to throw light on patterns of segregation and interlinkages, what my work repeatedly shows is the persistence of ideas of region, boundary, segregation, and difference. Vestiges of the old patterns of segregated settlements by community remain strong among certain groups, Muslims, for example. They continue to be as or even more ghettoized than before. Settlement patterns, however, also show deep cracks amongst some classes and groups, between the Catholics, the Brahmin Catholics, and the Brahmins, for example. So the memories and routines of separate habitation, however, remain strong. And given the breakdown of these economic interlinkages, like in the Jasmine example that I was talking about, this sort of social segregation that has always been Mangalore's pattern posed new challenges for communal relations. So by now, you should be asking, how in the hell does all this relate to her initial question? How do planners, and I'll repeat it just so that to jog your memories, how do planners, interested as they are in shaping the urban experience, understand or even use history to theorize the city? How does mining history to understand the city help us plan? So early on, I quoted Massey. In each moment of its history, the city is thus a focus of a wider geography. It is a space of continual change, negotiation, and renegotiation. So a historical perspective, combined with these strategies of survey and ethnography to mine memories and routines, allows me to understand Mangalore's regionalism over time, its reorientations towards different centers, its continued patterns of segregation and re-inscribed difference. The analysis provides structure and a framework for the work of planning. I haven't had a chance, and I won't be talking about this. So, I haven't had a chance to talk about the ecological region, in which history, nature, and time come together in a different sort of way, and which are equally important to these acts of planning, of managing the present and imagining the future. But If you think of the ways in which I talked about planning early on, for the planner as educator and researcher, these examples that I placed before you are about uncovering patterns. They are about understanding spatial memories around exchange, work, and use, which are enshrined in everyday practices and routines. For the planner as process manager, who seeks to bring people together to collectively imagine a future, this uncovering of historical patterns and memories presents extraordinary challenges that must be met through carefully designed opportunities for difficult conversations. For the planner as manager of change, this analysis implies cultivating a certain kind of vigilance for the ways in which patterns of difference and inequality are continually reinscribed. Equally, however, these stories point to the possibilities that exist if we continue to unearth and write histories that describe the city not as a stable entity controlled by a particular group in opposition to one to another, but as a series of encounters, spaces of continual change, negotiation and renegotiation, to use Massey's words, where change is life-giving, not life-denying. And there I use Kevin Lynch. So I'll stop over there and open up for questions and critique and a conversation. Thank you.